Hey friends, Mike Stenhouse here with another Only on the Current highlight from one of my previous In the Dugout podcasts. Remember, you can go to quick links in the top menu bar at our oceanstatecurrent.com homepage to view all of our Only on the Current episodes. As you know, there's been a public furor over the past 18 months or so as it became evidently clear how schools in Rhode Island were teaching anti-American, factually incorrect, and divisive concepts about American history. Parents became outraged and have been speaking out publicly at local school committee meetings. We've interviewed many of them on this show, as you know, and they've also been speaking out and posting materials on their various parent-run social media platforms. But top education and officials in our states apparently have a deaf ear to this pushback from the parents of actual students in their school system. In fact, the Department of Education is doubling down on their woke, misguided, and LGBTQ agenda-driven curricula. In this interview coming up, we get the initial reactions from David Randall, who is leading the National American Birthright movement to restore fact-based social studies curricula across America's schools. A curricula that properly positions U.S. history as an ongoing fight and struggle for freedom, not U.S. history as a history of oppression, I should say, by white supremacists. Earlier this week, the Rhode Island Department of Education put out a bunch of information, including its proposed standards for social studies. Now, you might recall that a few months ago, we spoke with David Randall. He is the lead principal advocate for and creator of a new social studies standard that is not woke, called American Birthright, and we welcome David Randall back to In the Dugout. David, I see you got, what is that, a Red Sox cap you got on?
Brooklyn Cyclones, minor league glory.
All right, well, thanks for playing ball with us on In the Dugout today. Okay. All right, so David, you've had a chance to review these Rhode Island social studies standards, the draft edition put out by the Rhode Island Department of Education. Look, we know they're woke. We know they're not we know they don't have the interests of kids at hand. We know they're trying to advance agendas. What is your initial overview reaction to what you've seen after reviewing this 450-page document?
And the big thing is that it is 450 pages. Thank you. And I should say it came out yesterday. So yeah. This is 24 hours in. So first off, it's huge, it's bureaucratic, it's unaccountable. It's 450 pages of education school jargon, confusingly laid out. It will be difficult for teachers to understand what's in it, virtually impossible for parents to know, have any sense of what's being taught in their schools based on this.
You think that's done on purpose to obfuscate?
It's so difficult to tell at this point. I think they don't mind. I think at this point, many of these education school bureaucrats have forgotten how to speak plain English.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately. So it's difficult to tell what's simply automatic and what's deliberately meant to obfuscate. They are actually clear enough in their content. And I want to mention a few things. First off, the anchor standards right at the very beginning.
Before you do that, I want to let people know what you wrote to me earlier today. You goes, I've skimmed through it, and you say, heaven help us. The standards do have a factual core of instruction. Some of the worst places in the country, Minnesota, don't. But still, it's terribly skewed and overly politicized. Yeah. You still feel that way?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So the anchor standards, and this is how they're going to approach teaching everything. And so if you go to, for example, page 5, civics and government anchor standards, I think you want to throw that up.
Yep. So here's the home page of the draft, and we'll go down to page 5, and you want to look at
we can power. Students will act as informed citizens as they, 3, analyze the purpose of government and use of power, including balancing order and freedom, to advance and control different communities and individuals based on their intersectional identities and lived experiences.
What
which is
does
hard.
any of that mean?
I think it means that the government oppresses you if you're part of a designated intersectional minority group, and that's what you're supposed to learn.
So basically, this is the lens through what they want to look at American history.
And
through,
look,
right?
and this is civics. Look at number 4. Argue how power can be distributed and used to create a more equitable society for communities and individuals based on their intersectional identities and lived experiences. The point of civics instruction is to teach people to create a woke identity politics revolution. It's just right there. That's civics, and then you're
all right. Now I'm gonna play little devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
Now this is civics, so civics, civics should be teaching about government, but civics to me also has a connotation that it does include some kind of citizen responsibility. So the fact that they're talking subjectively here about action, you could listen. I don't agree with it. Don't get me wrong, but it's so. Let's go look at history. I want to talk
when
more
they say
specifically
equitable
about
society, that means it's not liberty for everyone. It means imposed equal outcomes for every identity group in every aspect of culture, society, and politics, and massive government intrusion to impose it. But then go to
identify historical events that are culturally relevant.
Yeah.
What the hell does that mean?
And connect to students' intersectional identities and lived experiences, which is, again, this is, if you are identity group A and your identity group B and your identity group C, that's all that matters, and all of history is going to be done through that. And look at number 4, and that's what argue how social change, intersectional identities, and lived experiences.
It's everywhere. This stuff's everywhere.
Precisely. So one could go on, but it's all through the anchor studies. That's the first 9 pages, that out of 453. But excuse me, it tells you the approach they explicitly took for the entire social studies standard.
How does this, you've look, I want to talk about American Birthright just as a refresher in a second, but first of all, you mentioned that maybe it's not quite as bad as you've seen in Minnesota, but how, based on what you've seen in other states, how are these standards just put out by the Rhode Island Department of Education? How do you think they compare with what you've seen in other states?
They're as political as you get. They just have managed to preserve more of a factual core of history. They actually mentioned George Washington's name. They actually mentioned the existence of Nathaniel Greene. It's carefully chosen, and I can give you some of the examples so that it's a very skewed version of history, but there's actually some historical content in there, unlike Minnesota. But all right, let me give you the example, just so what I mean when I say it, 2 quick examples for how it's skewed.
Sure.
You talk about 19th century American, industrial history, and that's, if you go to page 313 or so, they mention industrialization they barely mention the idea that there were these enormous number of technological innovations that are wonderful. They don't give you the idea that businessmen created wealth. And this is crucial. They make it sound as if the only thing about industrialization was that a few people got wealthy and a lot of people were made miserable and needed government intervention for things to be better. The 19th century is when a massive number of Americans first got to have modern standards of a decent living.
So basically they're advancing the robber baron narrative.
Yeah, it's nothing but robber barons. There's nothing about millions of people who could buy a piano,
electricity, railroads, steel, right? All these great
indoor
technological
plumbing.
improvements.
Yes, I mean, everything that makes life decent. And the reason why everybody around the world was looking at America and saying, my golly, this is the greatest poor man's country in the world, not just for farmers, but for people making a living in this modern world being created by industry. And you would have no idea about how wonderful life was for millions of people based
Yeah,
on that.
and how our quality of life has been enhanced by all this. But even I would even go further, David. The core of all that, the robber baron, the tax rich, is such a fundamental lack of understanding or lack of willingness to talk about the virtues of capitalism, that if you produce a product and you can sell a lot of it and people buy it because they feel it's a great value that is worth the money, will enhance their quality of life. Who cares if anybody gets rich, because you're in essence enriching the lives of hundreds of millions of other people.
Yeah, exactly. And there's actually like way to put this perfectly when we get to the 1920s and the economy. And I'm just going very quickly towards that. Sorry, but in fact, they have a whole series of verbs about what about the economy, and there's nothing about creating wealth. There is nothing about what managers do, what businessmen do to make people richer. There's simply the idea that the wealth is somehow there, and then you need to extract it and manage it and somehow redistribute it.
Yeah, from these greedy people.
Oh, all right. I found, sorry, I beg your pardon, page 329. How and by whom was wealth distributed, capitalized, and used during the 1920s? Nothing about created. I mean, that's what you're talking about. That sentence in a nutshell is everything they don't have that's crucial to life, history, America.
All right, so I forgot to share. Hold on, I forgot to share my screen. Let me share my screen and show that portion right here. So here it is, page 329. How was wealth distributed in the United States in the 1920s? Right, yeah. So that's not created, not enhancing people's quality of life. Just how did these evil people? How much were they forced to pay to others? Yeah, okay. All right, so David, now look, there's standards. They put out standards in all kinds of topics. I'm sure it's no different in English or whatever else. They're infusing and injecting this diversity, equity, inclusion, woke stuff into every aspect of our children's education. We know that. Now I want to share here. They actually have a web page where people can provide their input. So my question to you is, what can citizens do, and what would you invite them to say? First, they ask you, who are you? Are you an educator? But then they have why are you interested? Would you be willing what if you were to summarize what a citizen can do if they wanted to provide feedback on this Department of Health survey? What would you advise them to say?
I want to say, first off, that's totally deceptive. They already actually, I want to say that first, why it is deceptive. If you can just go to like page 3 of the standard, they actually talk about how they created them in the first place. And that's important because it's why none of this is, why they're going to ignore all of this if they possibly can. It's that second paragraph, how they did this. Starting in late summer of 2020, they developed an interactive process to engage diverse communities to provide input, on skills, content, and equity, identity-based communities. This process was purposeful and included historically silent or erased communities. The intent was to develop an active feedback process that engaged communities rather than a more traditional and passive approach to soliciting feedback. That means everybody they wanted to testify actually already was involved in creating the document. Any comment is already made such that the most you can do is get cosmetic changes on something where they already got all their political client groups to provide the content for how it's structured already. This
kind of reminds me of a story we talked about yesterday. Yeah. We had on somebody from a group called Parents Defending Education, and you might have seen in the news, they filed a lawsuit against Joe Biden's Parents Council that he announced earlier this year. And they criticize it for being overtly one-sided, overtly left-wing, woke donors and all that kind of stuff. And the public pressure from that lawsuit, the legal pressure did force Biden to disband that biased Parents Council. I think you're saying here, the Rhode Island Department of Education apparently only sought out input from already woke biased groups.
Yeah, and they're saying explicitly, and they're providing an ideological justification for, excluding the public in actually drafting it and ignoring the public when they actually get a chance to speak. Now, every Rhode Islander should still speak up, speak loudly to say what's wrong with this, and say that you need to start over. And of course, American Birthright would be a great place to start with.
All right, let's finish with that. Summarize what the American Birthright social studies standards are, what your goal is, and how it's different from what we're reading about here with these draft Rhode Island standards.
Clear, coherent, concise social studies standards that teach the ideals and institutions of liberty. Brief 120 pages of facts, no skills, which teachers should be free to choose on their own, accountable to parents because they will know what is being taught to their children, and meant to appeal to a broad majority of Americans, not just the conservatives who have been excluded completely by the woke, but it's meant to appeal to traditional bipartisan consensus of America, because the core and more than half the material is based upon the 2000 Massachusetts History and Curriculum Framework, which passed through the whole Massachusetts Department of Education process. It was meant to be non-woke for the day, but it was consensual, and it got through Massachusetts. So that it's deliberately chosen as our model to be something which shouldn't just appeal to a small section of America, everybody but the woke.
Would it be fair to say that American Birthright, you mentioned the word earlier, focuses the social studies standards around the concept of our great American birthright, which is individual liberty?
Yes.
And that these Rhode Island social studies standards and in many other states focuses more on the concept of oppression. Would that be fair to say?
It's not just that it focuses on the concept of oppression, it's that
it
teaches students to be activists to join the woke revolution.
All right, David Randall, I'm pleased to announce that you and I have made a casual agreement that you are going to do a little bit more in-depth analysis. You'll document your criticisms and analysis of these Rhode Island social studies standards, and we will release it as a report from both your group and our Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity, and we'll look forward to reading and publishing that analysis in the coming weeks. David Randall, thank you very much for joining us again on In the Dugout.
And thank you so much.
All right, and we thank you, our viewers, for tuning in again today on this Thursday. We'll be back next week. So for In the Dugout, Mike Stenos out. We'll see you next game. Hey, thanks again for tuning in. And I hope you caught the really good news at the end of our interview with David Randall, that shortly after the new year, in conjunction with our Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity, we expect to produce a report with American Birthright to fully analyze. We'll talk about the good points. We'll talk about the critical points that need to be exposed in what appears to be bogus social studies standards by Alexander Infante Green and the Rhode Island Department of Education. Remember, just go to quick links at the top of oceanstatecurrent.com to see all only on the current episodes.